10 and WBT.
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you and happy Halloween. Well, we start off this morning with major developments in the presidential race. Yesterday, it was both the vice president in Kamala Harris alongside former President Donald Trump, both of them in the state, of course, not at the same location, as both of these candidates are making strong pushes and doing really everything that they can to lock down the state of North Carolina. It doesn't matter which poll you look at. Our most recent Carolina Journal poll, which came out actually 2 weeks ago today, or other statewide polls that have been released since then, this is a razor-tight race in North Carolina. Both of these candidates doing everything they can to tick North Carolina off of their list in regards to swing states. If you do, and you are somebody that takes a look at polling and polling averages, Real Clear Politics currently has the state of North Carolina at a 1-point advantage, just a 1-point advantage for the former president in Donald Trump. However, you'll note if you do look at most of these polls or any of these polls, they typically have what is known as a margin of error between 2 and 4%, meaning that those numbers could swing either way. We'll continue to track those details as we get ever closer to the 2024 general election right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. North Carolina Republican Senator Thom Tillis and Ted Budd plan to introduce what is known as the Relief Act up in Washington, D.C. That's aimed to restore funds to the SBA, the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program. The proposed legislation would provide over $350 million, enabling $2.475 billion in loan capacity for communities that were affected not only by Hurricane Helene, but Hurricane Milton as well. Following recent SBA announcements that they have depleted funds due to heightened demand, Senator Ted Budd said, quote, "The citizens of Western North Carolina are some of the toughest and most resilient people in this country. And as they recover and rebuild their communities, they must be able to access disaster loans from SBA. This recovery will take many years, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to cut through the delays and provide Western North Carolina with the resources that they need as quickly as possible." End quote there from Senator Budd. The Relief Act funding, which is intended as a supplemental piece of legislation for the current fiscal allotments, would be accessible under the fiscal year 2025 terms. With small business loans currently paused, the agency is encouraging small businesses to apply in anticipation of additional funding, but as we noted, there's no money there right now. The SBA administrator in Isabel Canales emphasized the importance of swift financial relief for economic stability, and Tillis echoed this in a recent op-ed that he wrote earlier this week, urging Congress to prioritize long-term disaster relief efforts as communities look to rebuild. In some other statewide news this morning, a polling company known as Vox Insights has filed a lawsuit against North Carolina's Republican Lieutenant Governor and current gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson, claiming that his campaign failed to pay a $114,000 bill for polling data. Vox alleges that Robinson's campaign missed the 30-day payment deadline without a valid reason and requested the court freeze some of the campaign funds, if there are any left, as we are in the home stretch of the election right now, suggesting that the campaign might deplete its finances by Election Day, which, if you're somebody that follows campaign finance, is not necessarily uncommon. A spokesperson for the lieutenant governor denied the allegations, stating all previous invoices were paid, and blamed a former consultant for the disputed agreement and the payment being withheld as of thus far. A lot still going on in the gubernatorial race. We'll continue to track it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:09, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Just 5 short days until Election Day. Early voting continuing to bang along across the state. That ends Saturday in most municipalities. Joining us on the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Chris Cooper from Western Carolina University to talk about early voting. Professor, this has been an unbelievable early voting period across North Carolina. I know you're tracking this stuff day in and day out. Give us some of the broad strokes that you're following and keeping an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so in terms of raw turnout, things look really good. By good, I mean pretty high turnout. Now, there's a perspective to say it's record turnout. I would say it's a little bit misleading, right? Because, of course, there are more people who live in the state than they lived in the state 4 years ago or 8 years ago or 12 years ago. So as a percentage, we're tracking a little bit below 2020, but things look good. The big story, though, is clearly partisanship, right? One of the few kind of iron laws of not just North Carolina, but national politics is Democrats do better in early voting. Republicans do better on election day. And what we're seeing is Republicans slightly outperforming Democrats in early voting. That's true in raw numbers, and that's true in percentages. There's really only 5 counties in the entire state where Democrats have a turnout lead that's significant over Republicans. So this is, I mean, perhaps a game-changing story, perhaps a speed bump on the way to a normal election. I think we just have to wait and see.
When you look at, and everybody, of course, tries to draw analogies to the previous elections, you look at 2020, and that water's a little bit murky because of so much of the vote coming in well before the start of early voting, well before Election Day with mail-in ballots. Is 2020 a good analog, or do we have to go back to 2016, 2012, and some other presidential elections to try and draw as good of a comparison as we possibly can?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison game is very, very difficult this year for exactly what you said. So somewhere around 19% of the votes cast in 2020 were by mail. We're not going to see numbers anywhere near that high this time. It's going to be maybe a quarter of that number. So yeah, you might want to go to 2016, but at that point, that's a pretty different electorate, right? That's a minute and a half ago, right? We're talking 8 full years. And so I think as we're looking at these early voting data, we're better off trying to understand patterns within each election. What I mean by that is like percentage of Republicans who have voted thus far versus percentage of Republicans within the voters at that point in 2020. So it's a little wonky, a little complicated, but I think the kind of raw number comparisons, it's not just apples to oranges. It's like apples to, I don't know, Phillips head screwdrivers. It's just really hard to compare.
That's a great comparison right there. Our largest voting bloc in the state is not Republicans, it's not Democrats, it's unaffiliated voters. We can tell based on some maybe midterm election and maybe some primary voting where these people fall, but it's kind of hard to break down this group and tell what split are they voting. Is it 50-50, 60-40, one party or the other? How do you begin digging into that and forecasting out what some of that might look like?
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, right? So it is the largest group of registered voters in the state. And one of the other stories from early voting actually is that they're not performing as well as Democrats and Republicans, but they are actually performing better than we saw in the past. So the sort of other truism has been two parties vote much more than unaffiliated. They tend to stay home. They're showing up in a little bit better numbers thus far. So we may be seeing that change. So you say, all right, which way do they lean? And you can look at which party primary they choose, but of the regular voters, we see that they switch parties about 46% of the time. So about half of the time, right? It's a really hard group to understand. I think is a baseline, maybe easy to understand piece, they tend to follow the partisanship and the voting patterns of the county they're in. So if you see an unaffiliated voter in Buncombe County, probably going to lean a little left. If you see an unaffiliated voter in, I don't know, Robeson County, they're probably going to lean a little bit to the right.
And as we look at those numbers, that unaffiliated vote, the folks are choosing not to be part of one party, Democrat or Republican, for good reason. How does that affect turnout? We know that the propensity of voters to show up and vote has been a huge message, especially for Republican groups this election cycle, getting some of these lower propensity voters, for lack of a better term, off the couch and out actually voting. Is it a similar situation that both the Democrats and Republicans are trying to do with these unaffiliated voters who they don't know fully what side they may fall on?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think both the Democrats and Republicans are using their own. They're not looking at the voter registration file, right? They've got other sophisticated proprietary data where they're trying to target individual voters and say, hey, here's an unaffiliated voter who we think actually leans towards our party one way or the other. And so, absolutely, they are trying to mobilize those folks. I'll say I'm a registered unaffiliated voter in Jackson County, and my mailbox is full of all sorts of interesting flyers from various candidates clearly trying to mobilize the unaffiliated vote. So, yeah, it has been, again, I think successful thus far more than usual. At the end of the day, there's no question Democrats and Republicans are going to have higher turnout rates than unaffiliated. But I think what we may see is unaffiliated closing that gap a little bit. And 4 years later, probably close that gap a little bit more.
Final question for you here this morning. How much does enthusiasm play into the turnout we're seeing essentially across the board? As you noted, lower turnout for Democrats, higher turnout for Republicans. Is that wholly having to do with enthusiasm, or are there some other factors there as well?
I mean, I see it as more strategic, right? The Republican Party has done a very good job convincing their voters that early voting is not bad. Matter of fact, that it's good, right? This bank your vote movement, the idea that if you're a good Republican, you want to vote early so the party will then spend less money trying to reach you, and they try to reach some low propensity voters instead. It's been really successful. The $10,000 question that I can't answer until next Wednesday is, does that mean they're just cannibalizing their election day vote? In other words, are they convincing people to vote early who normally would have voted, or are they actually growing new voters? And we don't really know the answer to that, right? So enthusiasm is important, but you don't get 2 votes if you're like super pumped to cast it. So enthusiasm only goes so far. At the end of the day, it's about number of people who show up and cast that ballot.
Professor Chris Cooper from Western Carolina University joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:16, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look on this Halloween morning of traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We're looking good.
It's 521. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, streaming live this morning, as always, on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. It's a Thursday edition, the final day of the month, and it is Halloween. All right, we're going to take a quick break from politics this morning. You often hear the talk about an October surprise in regards to politics. Let's change that up a little bit. Which candy tops North Carolina's list in terms of search results? Now, this was pretty shocking to me. We've got this over at carolinajournal.com this morning. So, a survey taken by Bet North Carolina, I'm not sure why they were taking this study, between September the 18th and October the 18th of 2024 got this in terms of results for the top Halloween candy searches. Number 1, candy corn is the first search, candy corn. Number 2, Skittles. Number 3, Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Number 4, Starbursts. And number 5, Milky Way. If you're and of course those are online searches. If you're buying locally and not purchasing those products online, North Carolina boasts a tradition of local candy production, offering treats that reflects the state's culinary heritage. The Made in North Carolina store has a curated selection of the state's rich candy-making traditions. With that, looking at some additional studies on overall spending and what people are buying for annual trick-or-treat celebrations, similar nationwide. Take a listen to this. 34 states had candy corn as their number one search in regards to Halloween candy. In terms of purchasing, this is according to data out of last Halloween, 2023. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups were the top purchased candy item for your Halloween spending. 72% of consumers in the United States plan to celebrate the holiday, with 67% of those handing out candy. Last year, there was actually a record $108.24 million spent on Halloween candy itself, and spending for the holiday as a whole is expected to pass $11.6 billion in this Halloween season. So if you are heading out this afternoon or this evening trick-or-treating with the children, candy corn may be the top item. Not my favorite candy, but I guess that's what search results show. You can read more and look at the top costumes by visiting our website, our story this morning. An October surprise, which candy tops North Carolina's sweet treat list? Yesterday, a busy day, turning back to politics this morning, a busy day in North Carolina. The vice president was in Raleigh, where she spoke for less than 20 minutes to a crowd at Walnut Creek Amphitheater. The president, former President Donald Trump, made his way to Rocky Mount, North Carolina. That's Congressional District number 1, which is one of the only, or is really the only toss-up congressional district in North Carolina. For the former president, it was very similar to what he has said and has talked about in past events. He spoke for close to 90 minutes, with that talking about inflation, jobs, immigration, the issues that you've come to expect being top of the mind in this presidential election. On the flip side, from Harris's visit to Raleigh yesterday, her comments and the conversations revolved around, of course, the former president, his inability to lead the country, and some of the things that she hopes to accomplish if she's given 4 more years in the Oval Office. We will get a report. Jeff Moore, one of our reporters over at Carolina Journal, was on the ground yesterday. He will join us coming up a little bit later on this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:25, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. In political discussion after discussion, we talk about Republican versus Democrat, but our largest voting bloc in North Carolina is neither of those two parties. It's actually unaffiliated voters. Joining us on the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning, Professor Chris Cooper from Western Carolina University. Professor Cooper, you have got a book out that describes and digs into this group. You talked and called them purple voters. Tell us a little bit about the book and a little bit about this group themselves.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So the book is Anatomy of a Purple State. And so the idea is trying to look at what makes North Carolina purple, and a little bit of the architecture of government, but part of it is looking at these voters. And we've seen a dramatic increase, as you noted, in these unaffiliated voters. It's currently the largest group of registered voters in our state. They passed Republican in 2017, passed Democrat just this last year. And this is a category we created in 1977 in the state of North Carolina. So it's been a slow growth, but a growth nonetheless. That doesn't mean that these are all swing voters. Obviously, most of them are not, right? Most of these folks lean left or lean right. So the way I like to think about it is most unaffiliated voters are not swing voters, but most swing voters are unaffiliated voters. If you want to find that small number of people who are scratching their heads until late about whether to vote and who to vote for, this is the group you're probably going to find them in.
One of the things that makes North Carolina rather interesting is it depends on who you talk to, either semi-closed or semi-open primaries. So these unaffiliated voters can essentially play ball in both courts. I assume that causes some of the large balloon of that population. They don't have to pick one or the other. They can play in both.
Yeah, that is exactly right. So we created this category in 1977, and for a spell, nobody chose it, or a rounding error from nobody. And the reason was we had closed primaries, right? So if you chose unaffiliated, you're essentially disenfranchising yourself from a primary. Who would want to do that? Answer, not many folks. Then the Republican Party, at a point where the Democrats were outperforming them in big numbers, said, maybe we should open up our primary to these unaffiliated voters. The Democrats, who at that point were doing very well in terms of registration, said, y'all can do whatever you want. We're going to keep our primary closed. So we had this 8-year period of what I like to think of, it's a little wonky, but the asymmetric semi-closed primary system. What I mean by that is the Republicans said, we'll have you. The Democrats said, we won't. And so you started to see the numbers tick up a bit at that point. And then finally, 8 years later, the Democrats got religion and said, maybe we should let these folks in our primary too. They did it, and then it was off to the races, and the sort of steepness of that slope of increase just took off to the moon.
Now, there's been some criticism as of late by both parties that we need to go back to this closed primary system. If something like that were to happen, safe to assume that we'd see a mass evacuation from the unaffiliated voter base here in the state?
I think that's exactly what we'd see. I think we'd see a couple things. First, we'd see a massive cratering in primary turnout. And then I think we would see the pattern shift that every day right now, whatever day you're watching this, whatever day you're listening to this, more people registered today as unaffiliated than either one of the two major parties. Clearly, if we had a closed primary system, I think that would slow down dramatically. You can even hear this on election day, right? Go to your polls on election day, listen to folks that are poll workers talk about when they do same day registration. Oftentimes poll workers will say, if you choose unaffiliated, you get to vote in either primary you want. Well, not surprisingly, voters tend to take that option, take that flexibility. We do have it in our control as a state to clamp that down if the parties decided they wanted to.
With that, with this group, it's so interesting. You've mentioned in the past that these are not necessarily, all of them are not swing voters. So if I'm a staunch liberal or a staunch conservative, why am I registering as an unaffiliated voter instead of choosing the party that most is close to the things I believe, whether that be Republican or Democrat?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is you may be being strategic and say, hey, I want to keep my options open in the primary. And I think maybe the more likely option for most folks is that even if you're a really good conservative or you're a really good liberal, you probably don't want to say out loud that you like political parties, right? That's a really unpopular thing to say. And so, especially in a world where, and I say this actually not making a joke, like if you are online dating, a good way to, keep half the dating pool out is to show up with, a Harris Walls hat or a Trump hat on your dating profile, right? We're just so polarized, and people don't want to keep themselves out of jobs, out of dates, out of social circles, that given the option, I think they're going to take none of the above unless there is some strategic reason to choose a party. And I think both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have got to do a better job making the case for why it matters, for why people need to register with their party. Because we've got this little bit of erosion going on, I think, in North Carolina politics that people don't pay attention to. There's fewer and fewer people to be precinct captains for parties. There's fewer and fewer people to contact voters. There's fewer and fewer people to run for office because of the slow deterioration of the party system.
With these voters, do they tend to be what are known as high propensity or low propensity voters, meaning they're likely to actually get out and vote in primaries, things of that nature?
They're much lower propensity voters than members of the two major parties. And part of this is just a function of who they are. These tend to be people from out of state. So unaffiliated is the largest group of voters born out of state, smallest group in state. It is the largest group of people under 45 and the smallest group of people over 45. And so if you say, even putting party aside for a second, who are the ones who are least likely to vote? newcomers to the state, and young people. So the unaffiliated group that's growing is also the group that is the least likely to show up in the first place.
Professor Cooper, tell us the name of the book and where folks can get it.
Yeah, so it's called Anatomy of a Purple State, a North Carolina Politics Primer. You can get it from UNC Press websites. You can get it on Amazon.com. You can get it really most bookstores in the state of North Carolina and even some elsewhere.
Professor Chris Cooper joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:32, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at traffic on this Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We have an instant.
A busy day yesterday in North Carolina politics. Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We've tracking some statewide news this morning. It's actually got a Washington, D.C. connection. Both of our state senators, both are Republicans, Thom Tillis and Ted Budd, plan to introduce a piece of legislation known as the, quote, Relief Act. That aims to restore funds to the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program. The proposed legislation would provide upwards of $550 million, enabling $2.47 billion in loan capacity for communities that have been devastated not only by Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina, but in parts of Florida from Hurricane Milton. This is following the SBA's recent announcement that their funds are essentially depleted as of right now due to heightened demand. In this legislation coming forward, a quote from Senator Budd, he said, "The citizens of Western North Carolina are some of the toughest and most resilient people in this country. As they recover and rebuild their communities, they must be able to access disaster relief loans from the Small Business Administration. This recovery will take many years, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to cut through the delays and provide Western North Carolina with the resources that they need as quickly as possible." End quote. The Relief Act funding, intended as a supplement to the current fiscal allocations, would be accessible under the fiscal year 2025 terms. With Small Business Administration loans currently paused, the agency is encouraging small businesses to apply in anticipation of additional funding coming forward. The Small Business Administrator emphasized the importance of swift financial recovery for economic stability. Tillis echoed this in a recent op-ed that he wrote earlier this week, urging Congress to prioritize proactive, long-term disaster relief efforts as communities rebuild. And obviously, we talk about the loss of life. We learned yesterday that the death total in North Carolina from Hurricane Helene is now over 100. It's 101, with 9 people still missing as of right now. Yes, the human toll is enormous, and the impact there is grave. If we look at the roads and some of the other major pieces of infrastructure, water systems, schools, public property, and buildings, courthouses, all of that. But thinking about all of the small businesses that operate in Western North Carolina, the mom and dad restaurants, the mom and dad bed and breakfasts, hotels, things that operate, the general stores, many of those locations are completely devastated. So they're going to be looking for some of this relief. And Senators Thom Tillis and Ted Budd are working and bringing some of that relief forward. We'll continue to track those details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:41, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. A busy day yesterday in North Carolina politics. Jeff Moore from the Carolina Journal joins us this morning on the News Hour. Jeff, former President Trump in Congressional District 1. You had a chance to spend some time at the rally. Give us a quick overview.
Yeah, so Trump came to Rocky Mount and filled the Rocky Mount Event Center here in Nash County. So like you mentioned, right in the heart of Congressional District 1, where we've got the only true toss-up congressional race in North Carolina between Republican Laurie Buckhout and Democrat incumbent Don Davis. Laurie Buckhout was in the crowd for the Trump rally, got called out and gave a nice salute to President Trump as he kind of worked the room and thanked everybody, all the electeds that showed up to welcome him to North Carolina again. you had several thousand people that came out, and he hit all the customary talking points on those issues that matter most to voters about the economy and prices, the broken border, and illegal immigration, and actually spoke to North Carolina specifically about really their resilience in referring to Western North Carolina. He's been keeping track of some of these early voting numbers, seeing how well Republicans are doing in North Carolina, and especially out west where people anticipated some real disruptions to voting. But so far, they are voting at a higher rate than the rest of the state average. So was able to get some nice touches on North Carolina populations specifically in there, and worked a speech throughout. It lasted about an hour with a lot of good applause lines and a good crowd that gave him a lot of healthy feedback along the way.
Well, you compare and contrast that. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, was in Raleigh yesterday as well. She spoke for about 20 minutes to a crowd of individuals there. Touch on some of the issues. You mentioned the North Carolina-based issues that the former president brought up. What were some of those topics, and generally what was the reception from the crowd?
Yeah, so as far as the most timely issue, he regards FEMA as a four-letter word in North Carolina, and got a lot of good response there because of the slowness of the response of the emergency services and rescue and assistance from the government sources in North Carolina and at the federal level. He was able to speak to that and also really just speak directly to everybody's real determination to get out and vote. He first mentioned all the loss of life and how that is the most important thing to reflect on and to mourn over, but also mentioned that when this happened, the election not that far away, and they started to wonder how that might affect voting. And the Trump campaign fully anticipated maybe 30-40% of voters being impacted somehow, but spoke to their turnout rates in Western North Carolina in the early vote so far, which is truly impressive, and was able to tie that all together with his message on the economy and on the security of the nation, talking about the southern border as well as foreign adversaries and the like.
With that, we know that the former president has won the state of North Carolina twice, both 2016 and in 2020. Jeff, we covered yesterday morning, it looks like the Harris team is pulling upwards of $2 million out of the state in terms of media buys in this final home stretch of the election cycle. You think that bears well for the Trump campaign?
Yeah, at a surface level, I think that's obviously a good sign for the Trump campaign. I spoke a bit with the chairman of the North Carolina Republican Party, Jason Simmons, about that, if they were feeling better after having seen Harris pull some of that ad buy in. But he cautioned that, listen, they have their foot on the gas pedal all the way to the floor, all the way through Election Day, regardless of what the Harris campaign is doing. He noted that she is still showing up in North Carolina. Tim Walz, her running mate, showing up in North Carolina in multiple spots this week. So even though that they pulled those ads, they see their presence in North Carolina, and they're not going to let off any pressure as far as the North Carolina Republican Party in conjunction with the Trump campaign.
Obviously, depending on what happens with the presidential race, there is still a huge emphasis on Congress. You mentioned CD1, the district in which Lori Buckout is the Republican candidate there. Speak a little bit about that, and if there was any talk about that at the rally as well.
Yeah, so it's specifically mentioned by President Trump, and I was able to speak with Ms. Buckout a little while before Trump took the stage, and I mentioned how Congressional District 1 has been just out of reach for Republicans for a few cycles now, but the margins of Democrat victories have become smaller and smaller. What does she see on the ground as far as the energy and if she's going to get across that finish line? And she was likening this year much closer to the animated enthusiasm for Trump in 2016. She obviously is going to be riding on a lot of coattails with the presidential race at the top of the ticket. She feels really strong. She knows the issues well and thinks that they're resonating well across Congressional District 1. And like I mentioned just prior, that the numbers have been trending towards Republicans in that district, not just among Republicans, but among unaffiliated and Democrat voters, because you've got a relatively more socially conservative voter base out in this district that's not necessarily in line with some of the more national Democratic talking points pushing farther and farther left over the years.
Jeff Moore joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 6 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks, Nick. In Southwest Mecklenburg.
It's 5:50. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We are also streaming live this morning, each and every morning, on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Continuing to track the presidential election as we sit here just 5 days away this morning. Yesterday, it was the vice president and former President Trump, both in North Carolina. Harris in Raleigh, President Trump in Rocky Mount, Congressional District 1, which is really the only toss-up congressional district in the state. If you missed either of those events, well, both of those candidates are coming back. Former President Donald Trump is scheduled to make 2 more stops in North Carolina this weekend, and at that point, it'll be just 3 days ahead of Election Day. Trump will be in both Gastonia and Greensboro on Saturday, which is the last day of early voting across the state. He is scheduled to speak in Gastonia at noon. That's going to take place at the Gastonia Municipal Airport. And later in the day, he will be giving remarks at the First Horizon, formerly known as the Greensboro Coliseum, at 7:30 p.m. for one of his traditional nighttime rallies. On the same day, the vice president will be in Charlotte. Her rally is still waiting on some additional details. It will take place sometime between 5 and 9 p.m. More details likely out from that in the coming days. Taking a look at polling averages this morning, Real Clear Politics has the state of the race in North Carolina at a 1-point advantage for former President Donald Trump. As we noted earlier in the program this morning, as you look at these polls, you look at these polling averages, most of these polls have a between 2 and 4% what is known as margin of error. And with that, the race could obviously swing 2 to 4 points in either direction. We'll continue to track that polling, all the different statewide polls coming out, if there are any more, as we head into Election Day coming up on Tuesday of next week. Some other statewide news this morning. A polling company known as Vox Insights has filed a lawsuit against North Carolina Republican Governor, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. As you'll know, he's also the Republican nominee for governor here. They filed that suit on Tuesday, claiming that the campaign failed to pay $114,000 for polling data. Vox Insights alleged that Robinson's campaign missed the 30-day payment deadline without a valid reason and requested that the court freeze some of the campaign's funds, suggesting that the campaign might deplete its financial resources by Election Day, which is pretty typical in campaigns to run that bank account down to almost zero. Robinson, a spokesperson for the lieutenant governor's campaign, denied the allegations, stating that all previous invoices to Vox have been paid and blamed a former consultant for the disputed agreement. You'll note that there was major shakeups in the lieutenant governor's office and in his gubernatorial campaign after the CNN story ran at this point about 5 weeks ago, and that's where they are pointing the finger this morning. Not sure we'll get any movement in terms of legal updates on this before Election Day, but we'll keep an eye on it here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. In some other statewide news this morning, we continue to track details from across the state. North Carolina Farm Bureau is suing the United States Department of Labor. The North Carolina Farm Bureau Federation recently filed a lawsuit with 2 North Carolina farmers against the U.S. Department of Labor. This is over provisions allowing temporary farming workers, which are known as H-2A workers, to unionize. In the lawsuit, it says, quote, "Our complaint is that the DOL, Department of Labor, doesn't have the authority to require collective bargaining or to provide collective bargaining and self-organized rights to workers. That's Congress's job." That's according to Jake Parker, general counsel for North Carolina Farm Bureau, in an interview with Carolina Journal earlier this week. Back on June the 28th, the Improving Protections of Workers in Temporary Agricultural Employment in the United States Act, mouthful there, better known as the Farm Workers Protection Rule, went into effect. That rule allows temporary or H-2A workers to unionize. In contrast, domestic workers who are either full-time or part-time are exempt from the National Labor Relations Act governing unionization. Parker noted the attempts have failed to include collective bargaining rights for those domestic workers in the National Labor Relations Act. He told the Carolina Journal, what the Department of Labor did is they tried to use the department's very narrow authority under the H-2A program to grant these effective union rights to these agricultural employees, when Congress has expressly said that the National Labor Relations Act farm workers are exempt from those protections. Additionally, the Farm Bureau argues that collective bargaining should be decided by the states and not at federal level, and not by the federal level at all. Parker said when Congress exempts those agricultural employees from protections, it left the decision-making in the area to our state. On August the 26th, the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Georgia issued a preliminary injunction in the case prohibiting the Department of Labor from enforcing the rule in certain state and entities. This injunction follows a lawsuit filed by 17 states. North Carolina, led by Attorney General Josh Stein and the DOJ, is not one of them, seeking to block the H-2A rule in all 50 states. The Department of Labor is currently complying with the injunction. In terms of timeline for this, We don't really have any additional details. That preliminary injunction continues this morning. The North Carolina Farm Bureau filed a similar lawsuit against the Department of Labor in the states of Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, and Alabama. Another lawsuit was filed against the Department of Labor in Mississippi by the American Farm Bureau Federation, the Mississippi Farm Bureau Federation, and the International Fresh Produce Association, as well as the United States Chamber of Commerce. We'll continue to track that. You can read more details on this story. Katie Zinder's got it this morning. The headline at CarolinaJournal.com, North Carolina Farm Bureau sues the United States Department of Labor. That's one of our top stories that we are tracking this morning. Well, that's going to do it for a Thursday Halloween edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. Coming up next, WBT News, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning at 5 right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.